Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered today on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin, the Anishinaabe people. Merci de vous être rejoints à nous aujourd'hui.
Thank you for joining us today.
2 weeks ago, a direct confrontation began. The Sudanese Armed Forces and Rapid Support Forces began a confrontation. This conflict ripped rapidly through Khartoum and locations throughout the country. And since then, it has escalated. Children are being rushed from their beds as bullets hit homes. Families are being torn apart as those who are able to try to flee from the violence. And thousands of people are gathering in temporary shelters with only a few hurried gathered possessions. L'intensité de ces combats a incité l'Organisation
The intense fighting has spurred the World Health Organization to warn of outbreaks of disease because essential services are not there. An estimated 50,000 acutely malnourished children have had their treatment disrupted due to the conflict. This is a heartbreaking situation, as humanitarian need in Sudan was already affecting 31% of the
Now the
population.
conflict is causing acute shortages of food, severe shortages of water, critical shortages of medicine. And we would like to express our solidarity with those who have been injured, with families who have lost their loved ones, and with those who remain at risk because they're unable to travel to a safer location. As a child, I was a refugee, so I deeply understand firsthand the poisonous potential of conflict on families, communities, and regions. And that is why Canada is deeply grateful to our humanitarian partners for their perseverance in delivering life-saving assistance to people in need. So we join them in calling for an immediate end to the violence. We join them in calling for the safety of all humanitarian workers. And we join them in asking for unimpeded access to communities in need. For more on this and our response, I would like to hand over the floor to Canada's Minister of International Development, Harjit Sajjan.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be joined here by my colleagues. Let me begin, too, by acknowledging that we are gathered today on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thank you for joining us to discuss the heartbreaking humanitarian crisis unfolding in Sudan and Canada's efforts to provide much-needed support. Earlier this week, I heard firsthand from the Sudanese community in Canada about how important it was to let Canadians know that we are responding to this crisis quickly. And we hear you, and we are here to support. Last week, Canada was there to evacuate 400 Canadians out of danger on both Canadian Armed Forces and Allied flights. But the situation is deteriorating, and the Sudanese people still need our help. Alarmingly, civilians are stuck in the center of this conflict with limited or no access to the necessities like food, water, and medical care. The situation is dire, and Canadians will be there to help. I want to also stress that I and our government condemn in the strongest terms the ongoing violence between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. Canada continues to call for an end to the violence in Sudan. We call for safe and unrestricted humanitarian access throughout the country. Ultimately, our goal is to promote dialogue and support peace. And just today, Minister Jo Lee, our Foreign Affairs Minister, returned from Kenya, where she was doing just that. She spoke with regional partners to promote the continued peace talks and a sustainable ceasefire. I know that Canadians from across the country are deeply saddened by the hundreds of casualties and thousands of injuries that have been reported. For many Canadians with roots in Sudan and the region, this is also a very personal heartbreak. This conflict touches their lives and those of their relatives, their friends, and their colleagues. And Canadians stand with the people of Sudan in their demand for a peaceful and democratic future. We also recognize that this conflict has a devastating impact not only on Sudan, but also on neighboring countries, including Central African Republic, Chad, and South Sudan, and others. Countries and communities that are already struggling with significant humanitarian needs and dealing with food insecurity and the effects of climate change as they seek to reduce poverty and build peace and security. Now, they are faced with additional challenges and are host to new influx of displaced people who need immediate assistance. The challenges are are immense, and they must not be faced alone. And that is why today I am announcing that Canada has allocated over $71 million in humanitarian assistance for the region, including over $30 million for Sudan. This funding will go to experienced partners working on the ground, including United Nations organizations like the World Food Program, UNHCR, and the UN Refugee Agency, the Red Cross, and NGO partners such as Action Against Hunger, Care Canada, World Vision, just to name a few. Canada will work with our partners to help meet people's needs quickly and with dignity. That means providing food, water, sanitation, and hygiene services. It means preventing and providing medical treatment for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as other health and protection services. And it means supporting partners as they provide emergency trauma care for civilians who are wounded by the fighting in Sudan. In this rapidly changing situation, Canada is ensuring that our funding remains flexible to allow our partners and host community to respond to evolving needs on the ground and to tackle new challenges as they emerge. Canada is here for the people of Sudan, just as we have been there as a longstanding humanitarian and development partner with them. Over the last 4 years, we have seen growing hope and determination for a brighter future. We have supported women's rights organizations and development partners promoting equality and democracy. It is heartbreaking to see that those hopes are dashed and to see that work put on hold. While our focus today is on humanitarian support, we know that the people of Sudan remain determined to build that brighter future, and Canada will continue to stand in solidarity with them today in the months to come. And in the coming weeks, I want to reiterate that I will be visiting the region to better inform myself of the future response, because Canada will be doing more. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
La parole maintenant au ministre Ahmed Hussein.
And now to Minister Ahmed Hussein.
Since
Thank
the
you very much.
conflict broke in Sudan last month, we have seen that it has had a devastating impact on civilians. Over 100,000 people have already left Sudan and become refugees in neighboring countries, and many others are already internally displaced within Sudan. Vast majority of the impact is falling on women and children, as is common in these types of conflicts, and we're really deeply concerned about the impact that this is having on vulnerable populations in neighboring countries, as Minister Sajjan has said. I spoke to the Sudanese community leaders from coast to coast to coast a few weeks ago with Minister Jolie, and they're very, very concerned about this conflict. They have immediate family members who are affected and impacted by this conflict, and they are heartened by our response so far in evacuating Canadians, but also being there for Sudan immediately, but also in the long term. We know that when these kinds of things happen, Canada steps up in a big way and joins our partners in bringing much-needed humanitarian assistance to vulnerable populations. And I can tell you that in this particular conflict, we are already doing a lot, and we'll continue to do more. We also have to be deeply aware and appreciative of the impact of this conflict on neighboring countries, and do everything that we can to make sure that this conflict is resolved as soon as possible. And in that regard, Canada is very determined to communicate to the warring parties that they have to bring an immediate end to this violence, this conflict, and give unrestricted access to humanitarian goods and unrestricted humanitarian access throughout the country to Sudanese people impacted by this. In my previous travels to the region, I have seen firsthand the efforts that humanitarian workers and organizations have been carrying out to help the most vulnerable, including in Sudan. Sudan itself was already hosting many, many refugees from the region. And those people are also impacted, and now they have to flee again to neighboring countries in order to seek safety and sanctuary. And so I want to highlight the work of those humanitarian organizations, including a number of Canadian organizations who have been very active for a number of decades in the region. And this much-needed $71 million will go a long way to increase their impact and amplify their efforts to help the most vulnerable. This conflict is devastating. It is devastating first and foremost to civilians. It's destabilizing the region, and Canada remains steadfast in supporting the Sudanese people in the immediate level with the much-needed humanitarian support, but as Minister Sajjan said, also to enable Sudanese people to build a better future for their people through a transition back to democracy. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
La parole maintenant à Anita van den Belde,
And now
secrétaire
to
parlementaire du
Anita
ministre
van
du
den
Développement
Belde.
international.
Good afternoon, bienvenue tout le monde. Je veux remercier
Parliamentary
Monsieur le
Secretary.
ministre de nous avoir fait part
Thank
de cette
you,
annonce d'aide humanitaire
Minister,
pour le
for
Soudan.
announcing
Je veux remercier
the
également
humanitarian
tous
assistance
de
funding
votre
for Sudan and
présence
the
aujourd'hui.
region. And thank you
Au
all for
moment
being with
où
us
nous
today
discutons du
as we
conflit
discuss
actuel
the
au Soudan
ongoing
et
conflict
de
in Sudan
l'intervention
and
humanitaire
Canada's
du Canada.
humanitarian response.
Aujourd'hui, nous annonçons que le
Today,
Canada a
we
accordé
are
plus de
announcing
71
that
millions de
Canada
dollars d'aide humanitaire à la région,
is
dont
providing
plus de 30
$71 million
dollars pour le
in
Soudan.
humanitarian
Ces
assistance
fonds
funding
iront
for
à des
Sudan.
partenaires expérimentés
These
qui
funds
travaillent
will
sur
go
le terrain,
towards
notamment des organisations
humanitarian
des
partners to
Nations
support the
Unies
people of
comme le Programme
Sudan.
alimentaire mondial et le UNHCR, l'Agence
For
des Nations
example,
Unies pour
the
les réfugiés,
UNHCR,
la Croix-Rouge et des
Red
ONG
Cross,
partenaires
and
telles que Action contre
other
le crime,
NGOs,
Care Canada
Care
et World
Canada,
Vision, pour
and
en
World Vision,
citer
for
que
example.
certaines. Au cours des dernières semaines,
Over
le
the last
gouvernement du Canada
weeks,
a
the
travaillé
government of
d'arrache-pied
Canada
pour réagir au conflit
worked
au Soudan.
hard
Nous
to
sommes
react to
efforcés
this
d'apporter
conflict.
de l'aide aux citoyens canadiens
We have
qui
worked
se
hard
trouvent
to
au
help
Soudan et dans
Canadian
la région.
citizens who are
Nous
in Sudan and in the
notre
region.
collaboration
We
avec nos
continue to
partenaires d'aide
collaborate
humanitaire pour
with
soutenir
our
la population
humanitarian
du
aid
Soudan qui
partners
se trouve
to
au
support
cœur
the
du
Sudanese
conflit dévastateur.
people who are at the heart
Je
of
souhaite
this
donner un
conflict.
aperçu de la
I want to
situation
give you
à
a
laquelle
brief
la
overview
population
of the
soudanaise
situation that the
est
Sudanese
confrontée
people are
et
facing,
mettre en contexte
to add some
l'annonce du
context to
ministre
Minister
Sajjan.
Sajjan's
Même
announcement.
avant que le conflit
Even before
éclate,
the conflict erupted, people were struggling to feed their families. The economy was unstable. Jobs were hard to come by. And climate change was having a growing impact on people's lives and livelihoods. Humanitarian needs in Sudan and the region were already at an all-time high. As a result, increasing numbers of people were on the move and were displaced within Sudan as well as in neighboring countries. Hundreds of thousands of people had also fled crisis in their own countries to take refuge in Sudan. The UN estimated that over 15 million people in Sudan were already in need of humanitarian assistance at the start of 2023. For context, just imagine that every single person in Quebec, Alberta, and the Maritimes was facing crisis. That's how many people we are talking about here. Now, this conflict is likely to dramatically magnify these already significant needs. There are acute shortages of food, water, medicine, and fuel across the country. Hundreds of thousands of people are expected to be displaced, placing serious strain on communities that were already struggling, both within Sudan's borders as well as in neighboring countries. We know that for women and girls who are already in vulnerable situations, conflict increases the risk of sexual and gender-based violence considerably, violence that no one should ever have to endure. Despite these incredibly difficult and rapidly evolving circumstances, Canada continues to work with our humanitarian partners on the ground to offer our assistance. I trust that I speak for all Canadians when I offer my sincere gratitude to the brave humanitarian workers who are working tirelessly to support the Sudanese people and are often putting their own lives in peril. Your efforts to save lives and help people facing crisis with dignity and compassion are making such a difference. Thank you.
On va maintenant pouvoir passer aux
We will
questions.
now move
We'll
on
now,
to
take
questions.
questions in the room first, but if there's people online who wish to ask a question, I would ask that you raise your hand, please. Let's start in the room. Dylan Robertson from the Canadian Press.
Hi there. Thanks for taking the time today. I'm just curious about the funding. How much of this is new funding? How much of it is reappropriated? And if you could just kind of walk through the share of it. It's 14 organizations at least. If you could just kind of talk about, making sure it's not spread too thin. Maybe these are just all the people who are able to scale up.
Thank you very much for the question. This is new funding that we have not announced yet. Having said this, though, this is funding that we had just allocated just before the fighting actually started. So what we've been able to do is move it very quickly, just doing a very quick assessment, trying to get the funding to the right place. As I said, over 30 million is immediately going to support Sudan and also the surrounding region. I will be announcing more, but I'll be doing that once I get into the region. Having said this, the assessments are going on right now. Jeff Martin Griffiths was just in the region. I've been talking to the various partners, UNHCR with Filippo Grande, and many others. Once we have that assessment and the UN comes up with their appeal, we'll put in additional funding. So the goal of this is making sure that the support is there. Once we have a better idea where the flow of the refugees are going, right now there's a lot of internal displacement, trying to figure out where the actual support can provide. The World Food Program have started operations once again in select areas. But now we're trying to determine where is the existing challenges outside of Chad, South Sudan. When we have that more information, we will do so, but we will provide you the breakdown for the recent funding as well.
Sorry, sort of an open question for the four of you. I think you each have experience in this region, and I think you know just how fragile some of these states can be, the ones that are getting some of the most people seeking safety. Can you just sort of speak about the importance of this not spinning out of control, and how can we actually do that to support these states who are, on the front line of this crisis, let alone the crisis in Sudan?
If I can start and then pass it over to my colleagues who have some deep experience in the region. I can say that even from my last portfolio to this one, I've been monitoring the situation very closely. In fact, I was actually hopeful that there would be progress in Sudan. It's one of the reasons when I went on my last trip into the region, I actually decided to go to South Sudan because the peace agreement was expiring. I wanted to make sure that the government there knew that Canada will be there to provide support. However, we had actually allocated funding for support. But it just goes to show how fragile the situation is, and it's always very disturbing when different groups, for various reasons, end a ceasefire and they start fighting, and the population ends up suffering. When I was in the Kukuma refugee camp up in the north, I met one woman who had 3 children with her. She talked about how many hundreds of kilometers she had to walk through the desert in the heat at the risk of the sexual violence that's also there, and how one of her child almost died. Talked to a young man who was actually captured along the way, and he was missing an eye, and how he was able to escape. And the reason I share these stories is because as we talk about this, I think it's important to put into context for Canadians what the reality is on the ground and why this funding is so important to support the people. But at the same time, Minister Jolie was also there working on the greater stability as well. Thank you.
So thank you for the question. I think that one of the biggest things to keep in context when crises or conflicts like this happen is keeping women and children at the forefront of the conversation, and also building those partnership between Canada as a country and these other countries that are in these crises. When you look at our plan, our beginning conversations between Africa and Canada, and building those relationships to continue to build on a feminist diplomacy. But that means that when we're talking about crises, wars, conflict, we have to make sure that women are at those tables. If you look at this specific conflict in Sudan, the people who are paying the higher price are women and children. I do have to say, though, I strongly commend the move that the government has made to bring people out of Sudan, and I can speak on my behalf, like as an MP for London West. A lot of families have reached out and confirmed that their families are out of the conflict crisis. But there's, I saw a video online of a child talking about how he doesn't want to go back to Khartoum. And I think that's a big lesson to be learned. And I hope that moving forward, when we address crises and situations like this, we keep women and children at the forefront of this conversation because they lose a lot more than other people.
So I think one of the things to note in this particular conflict is the fact that Sudan is the third largest African country. They share borders with a number of African countries that are already experiencing their own challenges with respect to stability and peace and security. So it is really, really important for this kind of scenario to emphasize speed, and that's what Minister Sajjan is doing with this announcement. He's moving very quickly to get the support there to address the displacement and the difficulties that are rising and the impacts that it's having on the most vulnerable. But I think what we're also demonstrating as Canada is a recognition that you, as MP Kayabag has said, you have to be there. You have to engage with our partners. You're seeing Canada leveraging the partnerships and the friendships that we have with the region to be able to not only get Canadians out, but also protect other refugees, IDPs, and work with them on a path back into civilian government. I think that is absolutely necessary because now is the time to act. We know from previous conflicts that the earlier you engage, the earlier you provide assistance, the earlier you insist on a return to democracy, the higher the chances that this doesn't spill into a much worse conflict for Sudan, but also a much worse spillover effects for the region, for the neighborhood. And so whatever we can do, we must do now, and speed is of the essence. Engagement and partnerships to leverage our relationships is of the essence. And that's exactly what we've been doing, and that's exactly what Minister Sajjan is doing now and will do in the future.
Marco, from My Politics, you have a question? Oh, sorry about that. I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
I'd just like to add the importance, both in terms of the work they do, but also the information that we can gain from our humanitarian and development partners. We have strong partnerships on the ground. These are the aid workers who are the last out and the first back in. They put themselves on the front line because they care deeply, and they have strong knowledge and partnerships on the ground, including with many of the women's groups. And, you know, as was said, we can't just look at women as victims. We have to look at them as the leaders and the solutions that come from the women's organizations who are very, very strong in the region, and through our own humanitarian partners. And, you know, we did see the tragedy of 3 World Food Program workers who were killed. And when that happens, it shakes a lot of the community. And these are people who are deeply committed. And I think one of the things that we as a government are doing is working hand in hand very closely with our humanitarian and development partners on the ground.
Marco?
To ask, in regards to the question that Dylan put forward, you seem to suggest that this money was kind of allocated before the fighting started, and there was this kind of suggestion that we were waiting for the UN to put forward, I guess, an ask before allocating more money. Can you kind of elaborate a bit more on why that's important and why that's necessary?
Thanks. And just on this, and the reason, for example, when we talk about the allocation of funding, when we talk about supporting people in situations like this, one of the things that we're putting an emphasis on, and me personally, is on conflict prevention. How do we make sure that things remain stable? How do we make sure that we support people through good partnerships so that we can prevent situations like this? Sadly, has not happened in all places, and we're seeing the impact of this. So because of the funding that we already had, I'd already authorized just a little over a month ago, we were able to move very quickly on this. And that's one of the things we always wanted to stay very nimble to be able to provide that support. What happens next is normally we start doing the assessment of where the actual needs are, because the situation is changing very rapidly. That's where when the UN comes out with their flash appeals, they determine exactly where the funding needs to go. So we end up, then we will provide greater funding there. I'll have to say, even with some of the actual appeals, even with the last one, even though the flash appeals may go forward, they don't get fully funded. Canada does step up for our portion. And the reason I want to say this, even the last one has not been fully funded. It was actually, for example, only 15%. So for Canada, what we want to demonstrate very clearly is when these flash appeals are forward, that Canada will be there, and we encourage other partners to also provide additional support because resources do provide a solid impact of preventing conflict. When people go hungry, that's when I get concerned because that's when conflict also can take place, and groups, whether they're part of government or not, can use these situations to kind of inflame situations. So the flash appeal will come out. We'll look at providing support. Once we do the further analysis, then we'll look at the long-term support that we could provide as well.
Great. Second question. We saw over the weekend some announcements regarding changes to requirements for Sudanese people already in Canada. Is this also a sense of waiting to see what kind of coordinated action the UN does before announcing maybe how many refugees from Sudan Canada will accept?
I think Minister Sam will have more information on this as well. But having said this, the thing that I don't think that's going to be a part of the evaluation. The situation on the ground is so dire that the calculation of the number of people that can come back, it won't even be, I'll be honest with you, register. Hundreds of thousands of people that are internally displaced. There are already refugees inside Sudan itself. And then people are leaving. And now you have over 100,000 refugees that are going into other countries, especially into places like Chad. So we're focused on the people there. I'll be honest with you. I don't think that calculation would even have an impact. The needs are so dire.
I don't see any questions online. Is there any questions online? Please raise your hand. If not, I think we have time maybe for another round in the room if you guys feel like it. Marco or Dylan, let me know if you have an extra question.
Always have questions. Just wondering if you could sort of walk through the medium term. This seems to be the short term response here. I realize you're hearing from the different organizations. I know that Minister Joly had been in touch with people in the region. If you could just walk through what happens next in terms of assessing our needs, and also you mentioned a visit to the region. If you had any rough sense of when that might actually happen.
The actual needs. This is sadly, I want to emphasize this. The needs were always there, first of all. And I think I want to stress to Canadians that, for example, we have a hunger crisis also taking place in Somalia right now. We will have more to say on this shortly. We have already allocated funds into the region. What this crisis does now just exacerbates the situation even further. So within Sudan, yes, we will provide support. We're also putting significant attention to their surrounding area. And this is something I do want to emphasize, that our focus on global affairs, our embassy teams in those countries, working with our partners, are getting the assessment of where we need to provide that support. I also will have a call with my counterpart in Chad to making sure that we send a very strong message to them saying that we will support. Because imagine the tension that it puts on a government when you have additional people that need to be fed, looked after, when their own people also need support. So we were going to send a very strong message through this funding of the, hey, we're there to support your stability. I will be actually the meetings that I already had planned were already in place. I'm making adjustments now because of the crisis in Sudan. I'll be actually going to Egypt for the African Development Bank meetings as one of the governors on the African Development Bank. This will be obviously a very significant topic. We were actually going to talk a lot about food security and how we can increase capacity within the continent. Canada's doing a lot of work on this. Plus, we're going to do a follow-up meeting with the AU from their visit here, and we were actually going to be listening to them about what the national plans that they have within the various countries and where Canada can actually better provide support. So rather than us saying what we can do, they were going to be briefing us on what their national plans are to better align our support with them. What this will allow us to do during this time is to make a much better assessment. I'm hoping to also visit Chad during this time, but we're doing an assessment so that way we can fine-tune our support.
Marco?
I guess the only question I would ask is, you're talking about when the UN puts forward another kind of a flash request for funding. Aside from Canada, are you talking, your international colleagues? You think anyone needs to step up, especially Egypt, for example, as it's a key player in this entire conflict?
And I actually want to commend Egypt and the surrounding countries. So Egypt obviously are taking refugees themselves. When I was in the region, actually in Egypt, we looked at their humanitarian, their actual response and the work that they're doing, and I'll be able to assess their needs. But because I was already in the region, I had that impact. But one of the things I really want to kind of focus on is that we look at the support. I always try to remind people that we try to focus on the families and what their actual needs are. Sadly, with the hunger crisis, and I have to also mention the reason I mentioned the war in Ukraine, Putin's war that he started, has exacerbated the food security crisis and how much of a pressure that is. Like when I was in Kenya, the World Food Program had to cut the meals in one refugee camp to one. Right. Luckily, we were providing more nutritious food into those camps that made it a little bit better. But just imagine now for a family that it can only have one meal. And that's one of the things I definitely want to emphasize for folks, that we are dealing with human beings who all they want to do is have a better future for their families. In Canada's the work that we do through our Feminist International Assistance Policy is focused on families through a feminist lens, which focuses strictly on them. And one of the things that I have also found, I want to give a shout out to some of the organizations that are doing this work. When I was, for example, in South Sudan, just imagine the situation that's taking place there, a very fragile situation because the peace agreement that was just recently expired. The women there were, through agriculture, creating economic opportunity. Now, may not have seen a big project, but they were able to now grow food with the research and the know-how that has been provided. Now, that's one village that does not require that immense support. More importantly, they're able to then take that food and sell it. These micro examples, they put it all together, starts making people's lives better. That's what we're trying to do. And one of the things that we also need to do, and this is what Mr. Joly has been leading on, is have that longer discussion of how do we get parties to discuss peace. And one emphasis I want to also mention is as my colleague just mentioned, is the work that we do in women, peace, and security. We actually support through Jackie O'Neill, our Women, Peace and Security Ambassadors, training for women to be peace negotiators. This is something that we're emphasizing, and we're hoping for them to be utilized even more so that there can be an opportunity for a longer lasting peace. Thank you.
Voilà, c'est le temps qu'on avait pour les questions.
That's the time that we had for today. Thank you to everyone who was here with us today.